Well, welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the SEEP Network, and we are so pleased to have you with us today for this digital workshop on Millennials and the Episcopal Church. We are excited to have this panel that has been brought together for you all, and it's going to be a terrific conversation. We look forward to having you interact with the panel by entering your questions or your comments in the chat feature. If you would put those there, then they'll try to get to them during the session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and let him get us started. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at another workshop very soon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrew Kryzak. I'm the Associate Rector of Christ Church Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And just by way of introduction, I wanted to say that this panel developed out of a conversation that I had with Joe over lunch a few months ago. But it also developed out of conversations that I've been having with people in the church for the better part of the last decade, particularly as the generational crisis in the Episcopal Church has become acute. The informal metric I use to assess the crisis is the frequency with which I hear the words millennial or young people in a conversation about the church. In my experience, this happens at almost every level of engagement, and it happens all the time. It happens in the parish, in the diocese, happens at the national level. And the data do indicate a dramatic variance between national population statistics and the demographics of our fair church. I presume that if you've tuned in this afternoon, if you've taken an hour for this, that you agree that that variance provides cause for concern. I should say, before we go any further, that I have used the term millennial in saying this only as a shorthand for younger adults, but we should still be clear about what millennial means more generally. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, millennials are those born between about 1980 and 1996. In other words, we're talking about people who are now in their late 20s, their 30s, and their early 40s. So these are not your Zoomers with their TikTok and their mom jeans. These are people who are in the workforce, people with careers and people with families. They're people whose cultural touchstones are the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal and September 11th, Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, and Spotlight. So all of that to say that our goal this afternoon is to offer some helpful comments about the challenges and opportunities of ministry with this group, and to provide tools and encouragement to parish leaders in a wide variety of contexts and geographies as they strive to raise up the next generation into the full stature of Christ in the Episcopal Church. I could scarcely have a better or more adept group with whom to discuss these issues. So our panelists this afternoon are Sarah Ardrey-Graves, Matthew Burdett, and Aaron Zimmerman. And I thought rather than my continuing to rattle on, I would let them introduce themselves. So Sarah, would you say a bit about who you are?
Sure. I'm so delighted to get to be a part of this conversation, y'all. I serve St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I have spent the majority of my adult life in North Carolina. I spent a few years in the Diocese of Virginia, in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And in my parish ministry, I have done a great deal of work with young adults. I currently lead a young adult group at St. Paul's of folks in their 20s and mid-30s, up to mid-30s. And then also led a young adult group in my church in Virginia. Both these parishes have very different demographics, different sizes. So I have a lot to say about young adult ministry. I also serve as the chair of the Commission on Ministry in the Diocese of North Carolina. So I spend a lot of time with people across generations who are discerning, who are interested in the Episcopal Church and interested in ordained leadership. So there's a lot cooking with me about where the future of the church will be. So I'm really excited to be a part of this. Thank you.
Matt.
Yeah, so I'm serving as rector of St. Thomas Church in White Marsh in Pennsylvania. I've been here just for 6 months, prior to which I was serving in Dallas, Texas for a few years. I was raised up for ordination in the Diocese of New Jersey, but was called down in Dallas, where I was really active in young adult ministry. I led a young adult group there for a couple of years at SMU, which was, we had some college students, but mostly people in their late 20s and 30s. And so here at St. Thomas, we've got a number of people who you describe accurately as millennials. And one of the things here is trying to figure out really where they fit in, and in what way does the church have a future for them, or do they have a future in our church? And so really excited to be here.
Aaron, what about you?
So I have to, just in the effort to make sure we're practicing full disclosure, I was on a high school swim team with Sarah's boss, the rector of St. Paul's in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
That's right.
And
yeah.
we were in the same EYC group at St. Paul's in the Emma Gribbin room a million years ago. And so that in your name was where I first felt the call to ordain ministry when I was a high school student. And anyways, but I am, since that time, I was ordained in 2008 in the Diocese of Pittsburgh and served as an assistant at a large parish program size, but I was the young adult 20s and 30s guy. And then after that, St. Martin's in Houston, and I was asked to minister to primarily young families. So kind of the same generation, but as they were now the next phase. And then came to St. Albans in Waco, Texas in 2013. And so I've been here for 8 years, and we have seen the church grow in all age groups. It does seem that some of the work that we do does attract and connect with in a meaningful way with the group that we're talking about here today. So happy to be part of this.
And I'm Andrew Kryzak, as I said, and I'm the Associate Rector of Christ Church in Georgetown in Washington. And one of the reasons why I came to Washington was because this parish has a large group of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And one of the things that I realized a few years ago is that when I was a kid, my parents were in their 40s, and the rector was in his 40s, and the senior warden was in his 40s. And as I've gotten older, that gap between me and the leadership in most parishes I come across has not actually shrunk all that much. And I really wanted to work with people in my own age group because I don't have a lot of experience with that, to tell you the truth. And it has been, really wonderful to come to Georgetown and find the senior warden's 41 here, which is shocking. I'm sure more shocking for him to actually, be 41 than it is for me to be working with someone of that age. But it's a really interesting parish and a place where, as a city that has a lot of people coming to it from all over the country, a lot of those people do find their way to Christ Church, and it's been instructive to get to know them and to kind of work through the issues that we're going to talk about today. So the way we're going to do this is as a kind of Q&A amongst the panelists. So we have some questions that we've thought through, and our leadoff hitter is whether there are things, what are the things that you guys have seen that are drawing younger people to church, and are they different from what has drawn and continues to draw an older crowd? I think this might be a question for the rectors.
Well, Matthew, you want to take this one? I mean, you've been in the job for 6 months, so I'm sure you have a wealth of experience.
Why don't you go first? I mean, I think I could think about it for a moment. Certainly, I think a lot of people are bringing their children to church. I mean, I think that that's a recurring pattern always is that people want something for their kids. They may not always know what that something is, but they're looking for something. And in many ways, what keeps them coming is really varied. So in my experience, the offer of, say, like community and activity is not always front and center. In many ways, I think people are looking for an anchor of meaning is maybe the way that I would state what I hear from them. But I'd like to hear from Aaron, actually, because he's been doing this longer than I have. And
okay. Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Here, I'm trying to pass the buck to you. You're going to pass it back to me. That's fair enough. I think one quick thing in the questions in the chat, I saw somebody's asking about a zennial. And I think which is on that, the people late 70s, early 80s, the people that are either late Generation X or early millennial, and I'm one of them. I was born in 1978, and I think Andrew's comment at the beginning that we're talking about sort of young people in general, so I wouldn't get too hung up on the definitions. I do think there is a significant shift that happens with the Gen Z folks, but I think, and it's almost, the more specific you get, the more you have to slice and dice, because potentially concerns of millennials in a rural community in Oklahoma or in West Texas are going to be different than the millennial concerns in a suburb of Seattle or in Washington, D.C. And there are going to be some common things. There's some memes that everybody has seen, but then there's some things that are going to be very specific. So I just wanted to kind of address that. And I do think this question about are older adults above 60 relevant to young adults? Absolutely. I don't know if you consider me a young adult as somebody who's 42, but I absolutely think so. And at St. Albans, we've seen growth in all demographics, but, and I will say that growth of millennials does not cancel out growth of people who are in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s and above. Any church that is healthy and vibrant, Lord willing, will be attracting people in all those demographics. But so to your question, what are the things that have attracted millennials? I think, again, there's not one right answer. It is not a group of people that are coming to church because it is their duty to do so, or because it is a societal expectation. A little bit in Waco, there's still some expectation that people go to church, but there's a lot less of that than there used to be. And so people are coming actually looking for some balm in Gilead. They're actually looking for spiritual content. They're not looking primarily for a place to volunteer, in my experience. Now, some places that may be different, but if they are interested in community service, they're probably already doing it with an organization that does it better than the church typically does. And I think they are looking for community less than we might think. Again, these are people that often have robust communities online and in person, whether it's their trivia night at the local pub, or whether it's, I don't know, lots of different ways people can get community. So I think what I've seen is people are really looking for a place to ask spiritual questions, to have meaningful conversations, and not just ask questions. We love to talk about, we live in the tension and we embrace the questions, but there are actually people that want answers, and we do have some, and they're contained in things like the Creed and the Holy Scriptures. And so, not to say dogmatic, beat you over the head kind of answers to questions, and but I think people are asking for a word, and something to help them with the confusion and anxiety and difficulty of modern life. As Brene Brown will tell you, and the social researcher will tell you, we are kind of the most addicted, overweight, anxious cohort in human history, also in debt. So all those things, people want some help. And I think, one of the things about the Episcopal Church is there are people that are coming to our parishes because of our progressive identity and reputation. They are not coming to be convinced that that is necessarily the right point of view, because by and large, the generation that we're talking about already has relatively moderate to progressive views. It's a center-left generation. And so we don't need to convince them in every sermon of the need of everybody to be included or whatever. Like, they already sort of believe that, and they're coming just because they know we believe it. So if that's already a given, not that we never talk about it, but if that's already a given, what can I say to you as a person who is hurting? What can I say to you, to a person who is grieving? What can I say to you who's a person who feels guilty? Are the things that we can offer in our tradition? So that's a long answer, and I'll stop there.
No, I think that's really important. I mean, one of the things that I think happens that we can see when you have a generation that has been going to church primarily out of duty, or of a sense of, the church being part of the kind of prefix menu of things that all grown-up people do, is that you get a sort of theological and kind of conceptual move to make the church kind of less scary. And what I think that has unintentionally led to, even as it has, allowed a lot of room for the church to move on important issues, it's also sometimes yielded responses to really pressing spiritual and emotional and theological concerns that people have about the world in which they live. And it's yielded answers that don't have the kind of rigor to meet the challenge of modern life. And I think that, when we talk about people, looking for answers and looking for a balm in Gilead, that it's important that the church not forget the particular witness of the scriptures and of Christianity, which does have the rigor, which does have the kind of backbone to meet those needs. One thinks about Chesterton saying that the problem with Christian orthodoxy is not that it's been tried and found wanting, but in fact that it's never been tried. And I think that we're talking about a group that doesn't have to come to church. I think about my sister a lot, who's 34, and she grew up going to church. She went to a high school affiliated with the Episcopal Church, and I can tell you she's the only one of her friends who still goes to church. And so she's very much an outlier as a younger person. So going to church is already a weird thing, and you're not going to be able to undo that.
Yeah. And I also think that there is a desire for community that is truly a landing ground for not just a whole generation, but for a world in which we're really afraid of not having community that's going to be there for us in those moments when we're seeing incredible events of violence and incredible events of loss that are happening to people all the time. The young adults I work with have really longed for community to be a part of their identity, to belong, to really feel as though that measure of belonging really means something and it's something that's bigger than belonging to the junior league or belonging to the Rotary Club. And Aaron, I think you said a second ago, like in terms of civic engagement, most of our folks have a way to be involved in the community already. They want church to be church. And so, I witness a lot of young adults, and I've served, so the young adults I serve are actually a little younger than me, like by about 10 or 15 years. And then the young adults I had in Virginia were a good 10 years older than me. And now I'm sort of seeing the shifts, but the desire between those two groups was the same. They wanted authentic community. They really wanted a sense of traditional rituals. And I'm not going to get into the whole right one, right two, traditional contemporary music. That's a matter of taste. What they were longing for was a sense of stability in worship, that traditional, Orthodox faith lived out in a real authentic way that mattered. They're also very interested in Eucharistic theology, the understanding of the baptismal covenant, and Bible study. If we don't offer those things in a sense of not that we have to reinvent anything, because we as the church offer those things as this is who we are, and we're not going to apologize for the fact that the church is the church. And I would say finally they are uninterested in being stereotyped and being told as a generation all the young people want whatever, because it's not straight across the board. And we have to acknowledge that, yes, there are generational differences in the ways that we structure our community, but the hungers are still the same. The hungers are universal across all generations.
Yeah, can I add one thing, just to comment on that I see some questions coming up in the chat about liturgical style, and Sarah kind of touched on that a little bit. No millennial I know of is looking for a millennial service.
Yes.
No millennial I know of really actually likes being called a millennial, because that term has been so ground into the dirt as almost a dirty word of a self-centered, entitled generation. So I think if you were to advertise a millennial service, it will die a very quick death. No one will come to it. And I think the idea that tweaking the liturgy is the way to attract young people, I guarantee there are not 24 millennials in your town waiting for you to change some aspect of the liturgy, and then they'll all come flooding to your service. That is not what is happening. I think doing liturgy well. And so at St. Albans, we're primarily Rite 2. We do Rite 1 probably about 10 weeks out of the year in all services. So you're going to get exposed to both kinds of services. Our music is straight out of the 82 hymnal. We have an evensong service that uses the 1662 prayer book and very traditional Anglican choral sacred music. And again, we are growing in the millennial category and in the retiree, boomer, and older category. So, our liturgy is straight out of the Book of Common Prayer, no enriching our worship or any of the alternative resources that were used. Not that they're bad, that's just not what we're using, and there's not a clamoring for that. So that's not to say that there's one right liturgical style. I think whatever it is, you need to do it well and do it beautifully. I think I think the one thing I can say is that they're looking for something authentic, which anytime you have to use the word authentic to describe something, it probably means it's not authentic. But I think they want something that feels old. They want something that feels meaningful. They are deeply allergic to anything that feels gimmicky. They're not a generation that wants flowers handed out on Mother's Day or some sort of puppet tier thing at the children's service. I don't know, maybe that works in your context, but it's just, they want something that's sort of authentic and real. This generation has been it's been trained on irony and truth telling in either, whether it's comedy or TV or podcast or whatever. This is a generation that has a very high sensitivity and allergy to anything that feels contrived or gimmicky or manipulative. And a lot of like tailored, like Eucharist, that thing is kind of over. Or a Beyonce mass, again, maybe in your context it works, but I think learn the language of the people you're trying to connect to and speak their language. And I think the language here is authenticity, a connection to history, and something that's spiritually meaningful and real. And I think that's I just want to kind of get that liturgical question, at least in our context, kind of to address that. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is, if you can meet some millennials in their natural habitat or young people and ask them questions, why do you go to church? Why don't you go to church? That's a good place to start. So if there's a farmer's market on Saturday in your town that is flooded with young adults and you never go to it, you're probably not going to be that successful in figuring out what to do in church to connect with them. If you're never listening to the most popular top 5 podcasts on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you're going to have a hard time speaking the language of the people you're trying to connect to. If you have no streaming services in your house and you only watch TV on cable, you're missing out on a huge swath of media that is asking big questions that your young adults are also asking and thinking about. So again, just the paradigm here is that of a missionary context, and that word can have negative and positive connotations, but we're no longer in a time where people just go to church because it's what you do. Almost everybody has never been to church or has walked away from the church. So you're reaching out to people that are kind of fresh in some senses, and you need to figure out what language they're speaking. You need to learn that language to try to communicate in a way that makes sense to them. As Cranmer said, you got to put the liturgy in the tongue, understand it of the people.
Of the people. Aaron had a phrase that he used when we were on the phone a couple of weeks ago, where he said, you also have to avoid the cringe. I mean, this is a generation, not just, millennials as such, but really everybody who's a digital native is used to really polished presentation. I mean, and I think I would be surprised if not everybody on this webinar, not just the panelists, but everybody listening, interacts with professionally produced music and video all the time. It's what you see on TV, it's what you listen to with your headphones in. And so the importance of doing a thing as well as you can do and not having it be, and this may sound like a cruel way of putting it, but not having it be embarrassing is really important. There's a question in the comments about whether we have a sense of the religious backgrounds of people who are coming to church who aren't fleeing some other tradition. And one of the things that is true in Georgetown, it was true the previous place I worked, it's true in most other parishes I'm familiar with actually, is that most people come to church because they're invited by somebody. It's a friend who says, hey, listen, I go to this great church on Sunday, do you want to come with me? Now, Episcopalians don't love to do that traditionally. However, it's organic growth. And if you are doing something well, you're doing it with integrity and with intention, and you do it because you really believe it and you really love it, and it productively engages with the reality in which people are leading their lives, then it's much more likely, I think, that someone's going to say, this is not just a kind of private thing that I do that's, you know, a little hokey, but I like it. They're going to invite their friends. One of the things that we're sort of talking about is I say with a bit of the sense of irony that Aaron mentioned, a paradigm shift. Talk about an overused phrase, but here we are. We talked a lot about, in the Episcopal Church in recent years, the end of Christendom and the end of a world in which people just go to church because they have to. And I wonder if that, if our panelists would make some comments about the way in which the kind of preaching and teaching within the parish should be sort of directed or positioned in order to speak to a world that has not necessarily grown up with a basic working knowledge of Christianity. Sarah, you have worked with college students, you've worked with people in their 20s, you've worked with people older than that. What do you find they don't know? And what do you find they don't have as, like, you know, sort of these sort of triggers that bring up kind of, you know, negative past experiences that we assume that they would?
You know, a lot of the people I have worked with have largely been a part of the church their whole lives. So I don't know that I have that direct experience, but I do have a number of people who have kind of seen the young adult ministry that we run, which is largely a small group format. And they come to it never really having joined a church before. Like I have a couple in my young adult group right now that found us in the phone book, that really like did not have any prior knowledge of what the Episcopal Church was or is. And the wife of the couple was someone who was baptized in my time. And, you know, to walk with someone in that journey of kind of coming alive to faith, when you see a group that is already kind of formed of people who have grown up in this church. Like I have people who, a lot of people who either grew up as acolytes or sang in the choir, and they're the ones who are the most convicted about belonging to a church, because those are the things that give you life, like participating in worship and having a sense of identity that I need this every single week. Those are the folks that make up the young adult group that I have now. And to say that, you know, a person is coming to a group like this and hungry for God and hungry for a community that knows how to live that out in a really authentic way. And if I could just kind of like speak theology for a minute, I mean, the church is the place in which the individual Christian is kind of called to work out their own understanding of God's plan of salvation. I mean, the church is not meant to be a place where we find our like-minded friends that save us from loneliness, or the people in which we, you know, all agree politically, or where we have our civic engagements. Or it is a place that that we truly believe is life-changing. And so I have found young adults who come to the church in the few cases that I've had where people are completely new to faith. They're hungry for the church to be the church and to be the place where community is lived out authentically in an understanding of God's plan of salvation for the world in Jesus Christ. And if the church isn't very clear about that, then it doesn't matter how creative or relevant or woke or whatever word you want to use. It doesn't matter whatever agency we have, that gospel will fall apart.
Yeah.
So.
And I think, you know, to your point, Sarah, God's plan of salvation for the world is not Jesus telling people to try harder to do better. And although there is lots of ethical teaching in Jesus's ministry, I found that it is not a surprise that he said to love people. And I think what is really significant to people, at least in my context, what I think really connects with people is to hear that they personally are loved by God and Jesus Christ. And there has to be a relatively explicit connection made in the sermon, because that's where it sort of becomes real. The liturgy is a lot of words that people sort of can, I mean, it's a lot to have your attention span focused on for an hour, hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half. The only reason some people don't fall asleep during the Eucharistic prayers is because we've made them to stand up and they can't fall asleep. It's just to this generation, it sounds like so much droning on. Sometimes, again, the words are beautiful and powerful and we say them every Sunday, but the sermon is a place where you can do what you've just talked about, Sarah. And I think that's what, there's some of the questions have been like, how attracting Zennials, Millennials, or older people. And I think, every human being needs to hear that Jesus Christ is the friend of sinners. And we can have different theories of the atonement and how that all works out. But something happens in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ that, as St. Paul says, reconciles us to God. And then that has a reconciling effect to others. And if we're not, I mean, this is my opinion, but I think if you're not saying that, you're missing out on a deeply felt human need of every single person in your pews, whether they were born in 1978 or whether they were born in 1968 or 1958. So I think, I mean, I'm kind of yes and high five and right on to what you said, Sarah, that the church is the place where we help people figure out how they fit into this God's salvation of the world in Jesus Christ, and to do that unabashedly, and because that's what people are, I think, really, really hungry for.
Although, if I can be a dissenting voice a little bit, so I was born in 1986. I'm a smack dab in the middle millennial, and most of the people that I know that I grew up with or that I've become friends with over the years don't go to church. When I was living in Texas, many of the people who didn't go to church had some previous church experience and had real negative attitudes about church. Where I am here, most of the people that I meet just don't care. And one of the things that I experienced as a person who was raised in church and always thought it was meaningful, and now find myself in ordained ministry, is the awareness that in many ways, I am a success story of a system that has otherwise been unsuccessful in large part for people like me. And so my perspective on like what I like about church in many ways is a skewed perspective because I'm the anomaly, not the norm. And I mean, I think the original question was the question about Christendom and about the slow decline of Christendom, where we live in a culture that no longer supports the Christian life in any meaningful ways, or no longer explicitly has Christian assumptions or values, or props up Christian beliefs. And I think that that's actually a really worthwhile question to deal with in a pretty serious way. I'm a believer in what I might call like trickle-down philosophy. Most people haven't read philosophy, but most people are deeply impacted by what philosophers write, right? There was a time when most people were Kantians. They don't read Kant, but they have Kantian ideas. I think it's important for church leaders to know well the intellectual, spiritual tectonic plates that are beneath the surface of people's lives that they're not necessarily aware of, but account for a lot of what goes on. I think the biggest hurdle that we face with a rising generation of people, whether they're millennials or younger, is not their antagonism. I think it's the basic question of why does any of this actually matter? Why should I bother with this? And I resonate really deeply when Aaron says, I am personally loved by God. that speaks to me. But I don't know that people really know what I mean when I say that to them. I don't know what I mean when I say that sometimes, and I have to be honest about that. And so I think part of part of the crisis here is a crisis of meaning. I think we live in a time, all of us experience this anxiety, when our words often only mean things to the people who already agree with us. And so I think a lot of the challenge of Christian preaching, of sharing faith, of building Christian community involves the work of making really clear to people that what we are offering and offering them the good news about Jesus is something that actually speaks to the reality of their day-to-day lives. This is the thing that makes sense of the lives that they're already living. I don't think what we're trying to do is offer someone the missing piece or a section of life that they were otherwise lacking that now makes them feel more complete. In my view, the Christian faith is that thing that makes sense of the whole, right? And at the end of the day, the hardest thing that I think I encounter with people across ages is the reluctance to see God as the subject of a verb, especially in the present tense. I think I see a lot in older generations of Christians, a willingness to talk about spirituality or to talk about spiritual practices or to talk about the Bible, especially historically. But I think there's a great reluctance to talk about the activity of God in the world in the present and the activity of God in our lives in the present in a way that doesn't sound stupid. And I know that that's not really an answer to a problem, but I hope that I do think it clarifies the problem. And at least that's the problem that I think that I'm dealing with. I'll say one more thing. I'm sorry to monologue. I find that it's important for the person preaching or the person teaching or leading to give voice to those things that people don't know how to give voice to. I assume when I'm preaching on Sunday that there are doubts that people have about the Christian faith that they either don't have the ability to express or a willingness to express or an awareness of, but it's still my job to tell them what they're feeling, that I hear them feeling, and to address to them how it is that the gospel meets that concern and meets that doubt. Anyway, I think I've said enough.
I think that what Matt just said connects to a comment Aaron made before about an approach to the questions that we're asking. One of the things we hope to do with this panel is to provide some sort of useful tools to leaders in the church. And Aaron's phrase before, again, said with some fear and trembling, was that a real missionary anthropology regarding a younger generation of people in the church is really important. And what Matt just said about thinking about the place that the people in the pews are coming from and actually knowing something about it could not be more important, especially as the church brings somewhat, antiquated conceptual tools to bear on very, very current problems. I had a mentor of mine say that, if you don't love a bunch of people, can't be their minister. And I know that I hear a great deal of rancor, as Aaron suggested earlier, directed at younger people. And I've experienced some of that. I've actually never experienced so much generational animosity until I put one of these on. And I can't tell you how many times I'm asked, what do younger people want? And I say a couple of usually extremely vanilla things, and I'm told, no, that's not right. Well, it might not be right for everybody, but it's right for a lot of people. And I think that a posture of generosity and charity and openness to a frightening new world for the church is a critical piece of what's going to be needed as we go forward.
One thing that occurs to me is St. Paul, just to Matt's comment about philosophy, is Paul says that the message is a stumbling foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block to the Jewish people, but we preach Christ and him crucified. And so if you see those as, that's somebody who knew the philosophical waters in which he was swimming and said there was something distinctive about Christianity in that, in a crucified and risen Savior. And there's so much to unpack there, but I think Yeah, and I think, you know, to your point, Matt, like trying to, and I'm calling you Matt because Andrew called you Matt, and I don't know if you want to be called Matthew, so I apologize if you have a preference.
Matt is perfect.
Okay, Matt, Saint Matt. So if there's I think finding ways, and this is the challenge of every generation. So for 2,000 years, the church has been worried about losing young people, and also for 2,000 years, the church has been worried about its collapse. I mean, go to Florence in the 1400s, and Savonarola was really worried about what the Catholic Church was doing, and I mean, Luther, and then the people that came after Luther who were worried about the Lutherans are now losing the message. So everybody's always worried about the church's collapse and the dearth of young people. This is what we do, is we wring our hands in the church. It's our job full time. And the thing that is the challenge of every generation in the church is to find a way to help the message connect with the people in the pews, the people in the bars, the people in the parks, the people online. Like, how do we make this message, which feels abstract, and make it real, which is why Jesus always used examples from agriculture. He never really quoted scripture that much. And it's why he said, you know, the chief religious ceremony you do together is going to be eating bread and drinking wine. Like, he always made it very earthy and very real. And I have found that illustrations in preaching to, you know, people in the comments, everybody's looking for, like, what are the practical things we can do? And I get that, because we're practical people. Jesus taught us well to be earthy. So I think if there's no point in your sermon where you say, now this is what, so Jesus said this thing about you, that the kingdom of God is like a pearl, the kingdom of God is like a seed that grows, you don't know how, or the kingdom of God is like a guy who had a vineyard and he paid every worker the same amount no matter how long they worked. And then to say, here's what this might look like in your marriage with your significant other. Here's what this might look like at your dinner table. Here's what this might look like with your kids, or if you're a single person or whatever. And I find those kinds of things and illustrations from culture, high, low, or in between, are really important to getting people's attention and connecting with them. So that's something that I think, and the thing, if you do that well, it'll work for any age group. I think everybody wants to know how do these abstract theological ideas connect with me in a real way. And to Matthew's point, you're allowed to say that this is hard and confusing, and we're still figuring this out, but you still have to try to do it, I think.
There's also a responsibility that the church has to be a receptive place for people for whom the kind of typical life cycles are not the norm. And I think that this is especially true for a millennial generation, but I think it's probably been a trend for many different generations, that, like, once we have an older generation, they become sort of the knowers of the people of the community, and they point to the younger generation and sort of say, well, this will look like this when you come along, when you have a baby, when you get married, when you buy a house, when you go through these, like, life cycle predictable patterns. And the statistics are that millennials are doing all of those things much later, or not at all. And I think our church can be structured in such a way that it makes it very hard to be single, to be not partnered, to not have children, to have a blended family. Like, there are many ways in which the landing ground for a young person in the parish can be really prickly, can point to some things that are not a typical life path. And I think that's important for us to pay attention to as we do that same hand wringing that every generation does, which is, where are all the young people, and could the church end in our day? Which let's point back to our theology. We are the body of Christ. Therefore, the church cannot die. And let's hold on to the comfort that the church may change. The church may look different than what it is. The church is not going to die. And I recognize that there's a lot of conversation about the statistics about the future of the Episcopal Church, but we believe in something bigger than that.
So I've said this to Sarah before, so I'll say now, to be provocative, that the church will not die, but the church is much larger than the Episcopal Church. And our concern with the vitality of the Episcopal Church is actually, I think, connected to making sure that it is identifiable as the church that will never die. One of the questions that's in the chat is, I think, one that should concern us greatly, actually, because it concerns denominationalism. Someone has written that most Christian voices that most people hear, especially in the public square, can be unsavory, I think we could say. And so a lot of what people think about as Christian is what many of us would consider pretty gross. I know that there was a long time where I was definitely very much an Episcopalian, but perhaps not much of a Christian, and that was something that had to change before I could think about answering the call to ordained ministry. And so I think one of the challenges for the Episcopal Church, which represents an incredibly small fraction of American Christianity and an even smaller fraction of American life, is thinking about how to productively use the Episcopal Church's particular history, particular kind of witness, in a way that is still identifiably Christian and is still being able to hit those the points that Sarah and Aaron and Matt have all discussed. Because one of the things that I think is true is that there are lots of different types of community, and there are lots of different types of spiritual communities, and the Episcopal Church, and more particularly, I think Episcopal parishes, have to be mindful that we do compete in a kind of religious marketplace. I'm sorry to say, it's a terrible and gross reality, but we do. And one of the things about Christendom being over is that the old kind of denominational loyalties have severely degraded. And I find this at Christ Church a lot, that there are plenty of people who grew up in they were Presbyterians, and then they became Methodists, and then they went back to a Presbyterian church, and they then came to the Episcopal Church. But there's no guarantee that if they moved to a different city and the Episcopal Church there is not something they like as much as the kind of Presbyterian church, that they won't go to the Presbyterian church. So, we should be mindful when we talk about, younger people in the future of the Episcopal Church, that it's incumbent on every single leader in every single Episcopal church to be marshaling the resources of the church in a way that, engage with the real lives of people, because you can't set up yourself on a foundation that's unrecognizable. And I think, increasingly, what it means to have been an Episcopalian, what it means to be an Episcopalian is not automatically ringing any bells. Especially with a group that is growing up in a post-Christendom era.
Yeah, anytime anybody gets up in the pulpit and says, as the lectionary says, 0 people know what lectionary means. The biblical literacy is also 0. Nobody knows. Just if you think quoting a hymn is going to get to somebody. So it's not just denominational allegiances has broken down. I think it's just basic Christian vocabulary or understanding. I remember just meeting a millennial couple in a bar one time, visiting Michigan for Thanksgiving, visiting my wife's family, and they asked me what I did for a living, and I told them what I did, and they said, "Oh, what denomination?" And when I told them that, I was just met with completely blank stares. They don't. So what that we had the most presidents and that George Washington was an Episcopalian. There's that has just so faded away. And so I think Episcopalianism in general is not going to be the thing that brings people in, I think, to the points that we've talked about. It's feeling something that speaks to them. There's a question about the church doing a good job of reaching traditional millennials. What about more creative modes of worship that allow for a connection away from Sunday morning worship, which they think, or they conflate with boomer-centric church? And I think what's interesting is that there has, boomer church is also multivariate, and that there's been a lot of movement within the boomer generation to get out of Sunday morning worship. That was their parents' generation. They want to get away from that. They want to get into the folk masses. They want to get into mass on the grass and all that sort of stuff. And I've found that traditional Sunday morning worship is exceedingly popular with millennials and with young adults, and they're very much interested in it. And knowing that not all young adults have kids or interested in children's programming or are parents, but if they do have kids, Sunday morning does tend to be an earlier service, like a 9 a.m. service does tend to be a better time just because they get up so darn early. But I think I think there's an idea that millennials are looking for something that is like church at a different time of day, or church in a different location, or church with a different kind of music. And I think the contemporary church model was primarily a boomer-driven movement, or even beginning earlier with the Pentecostal movement in the early 20th century, which was kind of the greatest generation movement. So I think I don't know that it's not a service. It's not a new service style that the non-traditional millennials are looking for. If they're not, that's more of like, how do we attract them to our churches? And I think this gets to a question we haven't really talked about, is how do you get out of the church and build relationships, friendships, meaningful connections with millennials and young adults where they are. And one of the most successful ways we've done that at St. Albans is something that we did not invent, but has worked well in our context, which is Theology on Tap. And that's something that I did at my parish when I was the young adult assistant in Pittsburgh, and it's something that I've done here in Waco, and has worked really well in both settings, because if you're in a restaurant or a bar and having essentially a TED Talk or a Q&A kind of thing like this, but it's panelists, and it's something that's a little bit interesting, maybe a little bit provocative, but there's no chance that anybody's going to be judged. There's no chance that they're going to stand at the wrong time or not know the words to the hymn, because it's not a church service. But it is going to be an interesting conversation about matters of faith, spirituality, science, art, philosophy, whatever. And the worst thing that happens is they have a cheeseburger and a beer and they meet some interesting people. And that's something that, at least here, started with 40 people and then grew to about 120 people. And then it was something people didn't mind inviting their friends to, because they knew that there was no way that their friends would feel weird essentially going to a bar and listening to an interesting speaker. And that's been the single most effective thing that we've found, that has then those people like, oh, maybe this church isn't lame. Maybe I'll go to it at Christmas time. Or maybe I'll go to that church at Easter, because they've already had now an initial contact with some of the staff or some of the clergy, and they know at least it won't be terrible. So that's one of the practical things that we said that I wanted to say, is it's been good discussion. We're running short on time. I
know we are. One of the things I want to highlight from what Aaron said is that the Theology on Tap thing is an example of how things that are content rich and content focused tend to be really, really powerful. People are very busy, and if they're coming to the church at all, as younger people, it is often out of a sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo, right? They're looking for answers. They're looking to make sense, as Matt said earlier, of the kind of complicated philosophical water in which they're swimming. And the more that we can do to address real questions with honest answers that are also kind of intellectually and emotionally and theologically and spiritually rigorous and robust enough to stand up to the challenges, the better off we're all going to be. Like, don't waste people's time with fluff. There's a question in the chat that this is one of my own hobby horses, so I really want to address it, which is someone asked, our church is very volunteer heavy. Like, who will staff those volunteer positions when we're gone? And I think that one of the things I wanted to bring up is how people are busy. Americans work more hours than citizens of any other country in the world. There's also a statistic that was shown in a graph in The Economist a few years ago that I will put in the chat because I love it so much, about how parents on average spend twice as much time with their children now than they did 50 years ago. So people are working more, they are spending more time with their children. And one of the things that, we're all sort of implicated in as clergy members at large, multi-staff churches with a lot of programs, is that there tends to be this assumption that spiritual maturity means you come into the church and then you have to volunteer for a bunch of stuff. And I'm curious to hear from my colleagues about how you guys think through that with your own sort of parochial colleagues as we go forward, and how you address, the kind of volunteer heavy kind of systems that many, many parishes rely upon as we go forward, and especially as you look at younger people who, in real terms, don't have as much time as they would have had 25, 30 years ago.
I'm going to name something that I think is obvious, which is that a lot of church programming and volunteer opportunities may have come into being to achieve something and often are perpetuated as an end in themselves. And so I think
the rummage sale.
Yeah. Or something.
But Aaron,
right?
it's been going on for 19 years.
We've always done it this way.
We've always done it this way, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, well, it is what it is, right? I mean, I think like, not that I'm interested in like killing programs, but I do think the church, you know, this goes back to like the question about like the Episcopal Church rather than some other church. Like, I think we have to be answering the question always, like, what are we actually here for? And what are we really trying to achieve? I think as Episcopalians in a multi-religious and an ecumenically divided context, at least the thing that I'm staking my Episcopal identity on is the fact that this is the way that I can most faithfully be a Christian. And so I believe in this, and I think that what am I here for as a Christian? Well, I'm here to be a disciple of Jesus and share the good news that he died and rose again for us, and that this is God's way of repairing our world. And there's a whole lot of stuff in church that has nothing to do with that, and it's all dispensable. And I mean, there are two paths, right? One of them is we continue on the same trajectory that we're on, and these different programs die a slow death from lack of volunteers and lack of interest. Or we voluntarily, for lack of a better word, euthanize some of these programs and really focus our resources and attention on those things that actually really do matter. Those things that really are focused on what we're about.
And I'll say that a couple, the way that, so this is always a challenge. And you can read minutes. When I got to St. Albans, I went through the minutes in the 40s and 50s, and they were lamenting then about the need to find more volunteers. So this is not a new struggle. We have found that mass appeals and invitations with like headlines, "We need ushers," gets no people. If an usher calls a friend and says, "Would you join my usher team?" or the altar guild person calls and says, "Would you help me out on this Sunday?" Or often if the director or another member of the clergy calls or emails directly, because people like to feel, again, the relationship and there's a connection. And the other thing we build into our newcomer class, the last session, is always ways you can serve at St. Albans. And we talk about that in a way that's not you volunteering as a sort of call of duty, but if you're on the altar guild, you're serving Jesus in that way because you're setting up the meal in the upper room like the disciples did at that first Passover meal. If you're serving as an usher, you're not just serving as an usher, you're extending hospitality to people that come walking in out of their suffering lives or whatever it is. This is an act of discipleship, not a volunteer thing. We try to get rid of the word volunteer. We also try to get rid of the word "we need." Instead, we have tried to move to, we're inviting you to do something. If you need something, it means it's probably not great because nobody's doing it. So trying to change it into something that they get to be a part of because it's part of our shared call in following Christ.
And, Aaron, you're really identifying issues of vocation, which is a place in the church that we have a real wasteland of when it comes to understanding your own vocation as a baptized Christian, and that there are unique gifts that each person that crosses our doors brings to us that could be put to use in a very specific life-giving way. And yes, that could be something that's very behind the scenes, like being on the altar guild, and people with gifts for organization, people with gifts for art and beauty, people who want to serve in a way that gives them life, instead of just sort of like plugging in a schedule of people. I don't know that we do that, that we do a very good job of that kind of reflection. And I find it in the young adults I work with, a real hunger for not just kind of the blanket invite, but the being invited in a way that says, I see you and I see that you have this gift and I would love for you to put it to use here. It might give you life, and I want to invite you into something awesome that you could contribute to the church in this way. It's a reframing that I don't think we're always very good at.
Yeah, I think we always run a risk of, especially in these larger churches, of kind of conceiving of them as volunteer centers for Christians or activity centers for Christians, as if people don't have time and are coming to the church looking to be put to work. Every time Pew publishes those studies on why people come to church, the top thing is that they're looking to draw closer to God. And if there is something that, and it will depend on who the person is, but if there's something that helps them draw close to God, helps them to grow into the full stature of Christ, then often, if not most often, people will respond to it in faith and with joy. Like if you're connecting with people with stuff that's actually joyful, they'll say yes. If you're connecting them with stuff that's a drag, then they're going to turn you down because, back to Christendom, just because the minister asked you to do it doesn't mean you'll do it. One of the things that we should probably touch on before we say goodbye to everybody is money. People have been asking about it in the chat. And I would suggest that in the same way that the money question is related to this volunteer question, not in the way that's often assumed, which is if you get people involved and put them to work, then they'll care more and they'll give money. But I would say that younger people, I could go off on a tangent about how, the millennial generation at the moment has 4.7% of the nation's wealth. And when the boomers were our age, they had 20% of the nation's wealth. So you're talking about a generation that at the moment continues to have much less money than their parents did when their parents were younger. So that's part of it. But also to take us back to the connection between meaning and mission and, people stepping up to the plate to take on a ministry. Younger people are value investors. If they're only giving you $500, that's because they only value you $500. The burden of proof, and this, comes back again to the Christendom thing. The burden of proof is on the church to meet the needs, the spiritual needs of the people in its pews. Our role, for those of us who are clergy, our role is cure of souls. And our mission field is one person at a time, and connecting the people in our care to the knowledge and love of God, which is in Jesus Christ. And I think we have plenty of examples inside the Episcopal Church and outside of the Episcopal Church where there are younger people who are faithful givers. And I bet if you ask those people why they give to support these institutions, it will not be because the institution has been here for 350 years and it's so important that it perpetuates, even if they're not, even if that's something that they do care about. I imagine what they'll say is because this place is vital to my Christian faith.
And one thing, though, if you talk to people who do studies in the philanthropy industry, there's because they care very much about this, there's about to be an $8 trillion transfer of wealth from the boomers to the Gen Xers and the millennials, which has already begun as they die and leave their money to their heirs. And so the millennials may not have as much as their parents did at this age. At some point, they will. And not to speak in crass terms, but as Jesus had people in his discipleship corps that provided financially to support his ministry, the church still does need people to support its ministry financially. And so, again, the question of reaching out to millennials and younger generation, again, any generation is always going to be one of the pieces of that. How we worship God in our stewardship is going to be in our finances. And so I think, but you're right, Andrew, I think the reason the younger generations give is going to be it's no longer every member canvas knocking on every door and everybody better pay their dues to belong to the church club. It's definitely much more, does this impact you emotionally and do you care? And you can even hear that in how NPR raises money. It used to be, send us your check and we'll send you a mug and we'll, it's kind of something we all do because we listen to this. And the way Ira Glass raises money on NPR now is just this very direct conversational, no gimmick, no mug, just let's, if this is meaningful to you, just speaking my voice to your ears, if this is meaningful to you, please support our ministry. Is that shift, that move away from kind of duty-bound civic involvement to, does this connect meaningfully with you in your life and speak honestly, to Matt's point, does it address doubts? And, are we talking about God? And And if that happens, then I think a lot of the rest follows. And almost I would say, if there's any trick to reaching millennials, is don't have a trick to reach millennials. Just do good ministry, preach sermons that connect to you and to your hearers, and talk about Jesus Christ and him crucified and raised from the dead and ascended into heaven. I mean, we have it all there. We just have to talk about it.
Well, I'm sorry to say, looking at the clock, that we are reaching the time when Joe told me I need to let everybody go home, so to speak. And it's a great sorrow, because there is so much more we could say. And I know that in planning this panel, I had conversations with every member of this panel that was longer than the time we just spent on the panel. So thank you, everybody who's tuned in, for being here. We hope this was helpful. Our email addresses are, of course, on all of our church websites. So if you're desperate to follow up, we hope that you will. A recording of this video will be posted on SEEP's website at some later date, if you'd like to share it with people. But thank you very much for being here. And thank you to Sarah, to Matt, and to Aaron, and to Joe and Betsy from SEEP for making this last hour happen. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye, everyone.